Okay, so welcome to part two of our Model View Controller MVC in ASP.NET with C Sharp and Visual Studio. Um, so if you remember the first part, we created a simple hello world, hello controller with a couple views, a normal hello world view and then a Minnesota and Wisconsin view. Then our controller could call those, and these were web pages, and the controller was a C Sharp file. But we didn't have any data model. So now we're going to create a simple data model. Let's track. The idea here is maybe we'd have an app or website that would track students and what clubs they're in. So maybe for our data model, we'll just track students' names here, and then and we'll have a controller for students and a number of views. Now we're going to want to edit students, add, delete, what we generally call the CRUD activities for these things. Create, read, edit, and delete for this. So let's look at how that might be set up. So first we're going to go into our models and create just a simple C Sharp class. I'm going to add a new item. Sorry when those things go off the screen. I'm trying to keep the size of this down to a reasonable size. Okay, I'm going to make sure I choose a class, and then rather than just having the class name class, I'm going to have this class to stay our students, but it's going to be our student data model. So I'm going to say student model, and that'll be our student data model. And then we'll keep track of some basic student information here. So we're going to keep track of a student name as a string, and I just want an example that's a string and an integer. Okay, and then I want an example of an integer modifier, so I'm just going to keep track of the number of credits a student has. Oh, and I'm also going to give every student an ID number, and I think I'm just going to make that also an int. It's not going to be their actual student ID number, but just a key to keep track of each student in the database here. I'm also going to set up some getters and setters for this to make these properties. So I'm just going to click on this and choose quick actions, and in quick actions I'm going to encapsulate these fields as properties. So in each of these, again, I'm just going to right click on them, quick actions, and then choose that, right click on that also. And it should create these properties for each one. So the variables will be all lowercase and private, and then the public interfaces will be all uppercase. And there's just a get and a set for each one that refers back to this private variable. Again, there's other ways of doing this, but I will just use this because it's pretty easy to set up automatically. So that's our student record here. Now we're going to make a student controller. So actually, let's leave that student model open. Under controllers, we have an hello and home controller. We want a student controller, so I'm going to go there, right click, and say add controller. Again, it shows up now. We were using empty controllers, and that only has the index action. You can also create a read write action here, and this one actually creates the whole CRUD: create, read, update, delete, and list entities, and it will create some of our views for us. So I'm going to choose that MVC controller with views using the entity framework. So I'm going to choose that for our student, and that'll just help get some things set up quickly for us. So in order to do that, we need a model class. So this is our data model we're going to use, and this is going to be student. So I'm going to select the student model, which we've already created. The data context class. Okay, I'm sorry. I said this one. You may have to cancel and go back. We don't want to use this whole entity framework because we don't have that set up yet. We want to do this model view controller with read write actions, and that actually does the whole CRUD stuff. So choose that one, not this other one. So model view controller with read write actions. So I'm going to add that. And again, the name of it is just going to be a student controller. So I'm just going to call this the student controller. And it should have the right controller class with read write actions already set up here. So we're going to add that to our field here. Okay, so it'll add the student controller, and then if I look down, it has an index web page, an action, details, a crate, another crate, an edit, another edit, a delete, another delete. Those are the ones it has for this. So, and the index one is actually a list one. Well, it should list out the items in our view for this. So let's do the index one first. It wants a list of students. So let's right there, let's create a list of students. So I want to create a list of students. So now as I type in students, I want to choose this student model, which is in this other namespace. So when I do that, it should add up here that namespace using that namespace. So autofill is our help here when we type in student model. Okay, so list student model, and I'm going to set that equal to a new a list of student model again. And then semicolon. Okay, let's see what am I missing here. I need to give it a name. I'm just going to call it my students. There, and then I think I need parentheses here to call that constructor for list. Okay, so that creates my student list. And again, that should be very similar to Java lists. And then I can add, I'm going to add some students to my list. So my students dot add, and so when I add things, I'm just going to create a new student model and call the constructor for that. And I don't have a constructor for that. So let's go to my student model. I'm going to highlight these, my three fields, and I'm going to say, go on to quick actions and say, generate a constructor. So it'll create a constructor. I've highlighted those three data elements, and it'll make a constructor with those three data elements. Okay, so there's my constructor. So now, going back here, I can call my constructor, and it's going to want an integer for the student ID, a name, and then the credits that I have. Okay, and then a semicolon. And then I'm going to want to, let's create three different students. And each one will have a different ID number and a different name. And some different credits. Okay. Okay, and I think add is a capital A in C#. Okay, so now I'm adding my three students. Now when I call my view, let's look, there should be a view already set up for this. So, okay, but there's not any views set up yet. So I'm going to set up these views. So this index view is going to be a list view. I'm going to click on that and choose to create a view for that. So add a view. But rather than an empty view, I'm going to go to Razor Views and add one of those. There's my name, and now the template. There are some different options here. I'm going to choose one that'll list out a set of data elements. So I'm going to choose that, and then it asks for a data model, and I'm going to choose my student data model set up here. And then I can just say add. Now, it might take a while. It might install some packages. And again, I don't know if you remember, but we mentioned NuGet is this package manager. And so it will run the NuGet package manager and install some packages if I need them here. And this takes a little while, so I'm just going to pause. Okay, and one thing nice about using the NuGet or that one is that that one does put the the view in the right location here. So it creates a student folder and makes the index folder there. It also generates a bunch of HTML for us that'll actually looks at our data model and displays the necessary things for our data model. Now, I'm not going to go over this HTML here and how it's a mixture of actually C# with HTML. So there's some C# stuff in here and then some direct HTML to create a tables here. And it's looping through items in our data model and stuff like that. I'm not going to worry about that. I basically just want you to kind of understand model view controllers for this. So, but that index one is set up. So now I should be able to display that, and hopefully the site will display my 3 students I added. So again, when I run this, it just goes to the default local host and then I'm going to go to the student controller. So type in student, and I won't have to specify a view because it'll run the index view automatically for me. And if I've done everything right, it should come back here and work okay. So it's having some problems because it's looking for a data model and it's not finding one. So let's stop this and see what our problem is. So when I call this view, the list view, I need to provide a data model. So if I go back to my student controller, I created this list view called my student, but I didn't pass it to view. So I'm going to do that. Now the first parameter in view has to be the name of the view you're running, and index is going to be the name of the view, and then the data model should be passed next here. So it's actually looking for an array of elements. In fact, if I look in the student view here, yeah, the model, the data model this is based on is here's my student model, and you would think this would be view here. I mean a list of students, but list is actually too specific, and this actually will take any of a number of list items here. It'll take a list or an array or a number of things, and so there's an interface called IEnumerable which all those things belong to. So IEnumerable is just a generic version of list, and that's what it's looking for. So I need to send that to there. So again, when I call my view, I'm going to pass it the index, the name of the view to open up, and then the list of all my students. So once I do this, now if I run this, hopefully it won't get an error. Okay, so if I go to my student controller here and see things, I can see those are my 3 students I've added, and it creates a table and displays that all for me. It also has some nice interfaces here. It has a button to create a new student, edit that student, display details on that student, or delete that student. Here. Now, if I try to click on one of these, let's say I want to see the details of this student, I can click on that, and it'll open up the student details view. But again, I don't have the student details view defined yet, so it's going to give me an error. So let's try to do that here. Okay, so the index view is doing a list. Now, here's the next one is the details view, and I'm going to return a view. And I should return this a single student, and it gives me a student ID here, and it will show that student ID with that student ID here. Um, so, but one problem I have is right now this is all local variables in this folder. So I'm going to want to move these out of here, not inside this. So I'm going to take these out of here, go up to the top of my class, and add them in there. Now the declaration for this variable is fine here, but this code here it needs to be in a method of some sort. And I don't want it in one of my view methods. I want, when the controller first starts up, I want it to run. So I need an actual constructor for this student controller here. So I'm just going to do quick actions and say generate, nope, I'm just going to go, yeah, here and say generate constructor. Yeah, generate constructor. And I don't need any variables in that. So it's just going to make a default constructor here. Sometimes I think my shortcuts don't actually save as much time as I think they should. Okay, copy that code into the constructor. So my constructor now declare my students, and in the constructor for the student controller, it'll add all the student models there. So now my students will be available in any of these methods. So we did the index method, and we're just returning all the students, but details, I want to return a specific student. So under view, again, I always have to re-specify the name of the view I'm going to do, and that is just the name of the controller. And then I want to specify a single student. So let's just do the first student by default, student number 1, which is actually the second student because this is 0 based. So let's actually do student 0. That's me. Okay, so that should display that student whenever I go to that view. Okay, so now if I click on this, wait for my website to start up, I'll go to my student folder or view controller. And now student view, I can then click on details, and let's see if this will work. Okay, and it says view details not found. It's like as if I don't have it. I forgot to add the view. So let's go see. So back here, remember I haven't added that actual view here. I've just added the controller. So again, I'm going to go in here and I'm going to right click and say add view. I'm going to choose a razor view here. Not an empty one. And this is called details. And again, the data model, I want to display details about that data model. The model class is my student model, and then I can just add that. And again, now it'll add the details view here. And I should actually I can add the rest of my views as I go. So now the details page HTML view is set up here, just like my index view was. Oh, I should say, and it is nice in there, the data model, and then this is just one student. It just looks for one student that it's looking for. So that's why I know in my student controller just to send a single student. So I'm sending student 0. I should use the ID at some point, but right now I'm just sending student 0. So let's see how that works. So it'll always display whatever, no matter what ID, should always display student 0 for now. Okay, now let's see. So I've got my students here, and I can display, this is Tom, display details on Tom, and there's information on Tom, and I go back to my list, and it goes back to the index, and I can display details on Jen, but it's going to display details on Tom, because again, I'm always displaying the 0th record, even though I'm giving it different IDs. So this whole thing is set up so it will, when I click on these different things, it'll call student and pass it the information of the right ID number to pass there. So I really should be here using this ID to do something. So I can actually just switch this to the ID number. Now, right now, I think the student ID matches. Let's see what student's ID. 123. We'll see if that will work. If the ID here will match the ID here. I don't know if it's giving me this ID variable that I declared or just the index into the array. So let's try that again. Okay, so I'm going to go to my student page, details, that one's Tom, that one works okay. This one should be, this is Tom again. And this one is still Tom. So something's not working with that. So let's go back and look at that. Okay, so it seems like when we're running our details view, it's not getting the student ID here. And I can actually look, I can actually put in a little breakpoint here and run this. And I can actually see that no matter which item I select, it has the ID set to 0. And so something's wrong with my list view, and we'll see that in just a sec. So here I'm in my student view. I click on one of my students here, like the third one, and I have this breakpoint here, so it stops here, and it'll tell me the ID value is 0. If I continue on here and try to click on a different list item for details, again it stops here again, and again my ID value is always 0. So the ID is not getting set right. So even though I'm processing it fine from there, it's not getting set here. So I'm going to get rid of that breakpoint, and then look, and then if I look in my index view, there's a menu here of action items towards the bottom, and for each one of edit, detail, and delete, it creates a new record, and it should be specifying it's by default it says ID equals item dot primary key. And again, we do this a lot. We refer to the item that's passed in dot and then the name of the field in the student record. And they're commented out here, and so I need to get rid of these comments. And then where it says primary key, that's not my field. I need to change it. And so in my student model, if you remember correctly, I just have an ID field, and in fact the method to get that, the public method, is just capital ID. So I'm going to just go back to this index field, and then instead of my primary key is actually ID. And same here, and same for that. So this should pass the right student ID back to this. So now if I go back to my controller here, I should see the right student ID being passed in here. Let's put the breakpoint back in here so I can see that. I'm going to make sure I've saved this and then run this. Here, and I click on Sabah with student ID 3. The breakpoint will stop here, and it'll show that yes, the ID is being set to 3 for this. Okay, so now I can actually run this. Now, the ID doesn't match exactly the spot in the array here. It's actually one less. So I'm going to actually change this so that the IDs are 0, 1, and 2, so that for now that'll correspond to their index in the list. So then I can use the array, the ID as my array index into the list. So then this should work. Okay, now I can run this and hopefully display details on each student. So I can click on Jen and see her information, go back to list and see Tom's information and go back to list. So I can now see any of these student informations in my list. Now, we don't have edit or delete working yet because we don't have views set up here and we don't have create new set up yet. But we're not going to worry about that yet. We'll let you work on that for the assignment here. And also, it is only, so let's look at one other thing. Let's stop this. Now, right now in all my data, in my data model here, I have in the models folder, I just have the student model, but I actually have some of my data model here. Now, in a real world, we'd probably have a database and we'd probably have a method over here that would create this database and use that. Or else do an object relational mapping that would map the database into objects. But we're going to use just this list here, but it should be over here. So I'm going to create one more class here. And that's going to be I'm going to go to new item and do a new class. And I'm going to have a list of students there. So I'm going to call that my student repository or something like that. Student repository. So that'll be my collection of students here. And then back in my student controller, I'm going to move this information, this list, into that student repository. So it's going to have my list of students. I'm going to make a constructor for that student repository with no parameters. And in that constructor, I'm going to stick in my code here. So basically, I've just moved all that code from the controller into the student repository. So that's going to create my students. And again, in a real world, I should be reading these student data from a database and create and bring them into my list or something like that here. Okay, so that's now I have the student repository. Now in my student controller, I'm going to use that. So I'm going to refer to that student controller. So I'm just going to say, well, actually, in my student repository, I can just make a couple methods. So one thing I can do is just get the list of all the students. So maybe I'll make a method, a public method, get all students. And that's just going to return this whole list of my students here. And so the return type of this is going to be a list of students. Eventually, we'll often with return types be using this IEnumeral type, but for now I can just leave that there. So in my controller class here, when I'm getting my list rather than calling my students here, I can use my student repository, but I need to then I need a variable for that. So I'm just going to have a student repository here. And then call it the students, just use a slightly different name so I know what that is. And just say new student repository. So I now have the students as my student repository. Actually, let's make that a little different since I now have that. I'll just call it student repo. So that'll be my list of students. So now I can use that. So I can say student repo dot get all students to get all the students for this list variable. So again, I'm moving stuff inside my controller. I don't want that much data stuff. The data stuff should be in the model area. So my list of students, my individual student model, all that stuff should be in my model, my data model folder. And my controller should just act as an interface between that and the views. So now if I run this, this should work out okay. Oh, I should have an error, shouldn't I? Yeah. What I don't have yet is get a particular student. I need to do that. So my student repository needs to not only get all the students, but get a particular student. So I need another public method that's just going to return a student model. And I'm going to say get one student. And I'm going to specify an index for that. And then I'm going to just return my students sub and then whatever index I provide for now. Okay, so now I have a get all students and a get one student. And so now back in my controller, I can use that. So here I'm going to say, use my student repository, my student repo dot get one student, and then specify the ID there as a parameter. Okay, now I should be compiling and hopefully running. So again, I've just pushed all my student information out of the controller and into this data models folder and created a student repo, student repository, which is basically just my list of students there. And so my functionality should be the same. My student should be listed out. All the students should list out using the student repository. I can click on any student and get information on that. Okay, so again, delete, edit, and create new. Those activities don't work yet because I haven't implemented those items. Now in my student controller, I have a create, I have an edit, I have a couple and a delete. But again, I don't have the views set up yet for those, and then I'm not passing code, I'm not passing students or whatever to those views also. But this is where we'll wrap up for this.